It is great to see a series that had so much potential finally get another chance after being dormant for so long. It's been over a decade since the last Armored Core game. I've never gotten too immersed into the series myself, but looking at how the last couple of AC games were, it seems like From Software didn't really know what to do anymore with the franchise once Miyazaki came in and started making the Souls games, and so eventually it just fizzled out. I've only played a bit of Armored Core for Answer, but I really enjoyed my time with it despite the insanely unfamiliar control scheme it used. Fortunately, with Armored Core 6, the controls are a lot more traditional and for all the better. The jump and fly button is the same as it is in most other modern games, as are the directional controls and attack buttons. I still had to get used to it as they don't make it too easy for you to control this giant hunk of metal, but that's fine because it presented a very attractive learning curve that is satisfying to progress through. In the first mission, there's a really fun boss at the end, and regrettably, I found myself dying several times before I could get the hang of it. And there was that classic click moment that you always have in a FromSoft game. After you've been dying over and over, relentlessly throwing yourself at the boss because you'd start hating yourself if you ever stop trying, and then finally...
Did you pray today? Did you pray today? Because
No,
if you didn't, I'ma have to... Make sure that you're praying, bro. Making sure that your soul is better, bro. Make sure you're raising your spirits, bro.
The combat is as satisfying and fun as it should be, and it feels almost effortless to skirt around the maps and run circles around your enemies. While the level designs are drastically different than that of a Souls game, with them being closed off missions and all, there's still some exploration involved and reward for doing so. While the main focus is on completing the main objective at hand as effectively as possible, there will be optional side goals throughout most of the missions, such as mini-bosses, collectibles, and apparently even loot crates. You'll get paid at the end of each mission depending on how well you did and what objectives you completed. You'll then get to spend that money in the shop where you can buy new parts and weapons for your AC. This game does, however, have taxes, sort of, in that a certain amount of money will be taken out of your earnings from each mission to pay for ammunition and repair costs. But don't fret, it's hardly noticeable. They said that if this game did well, then in the sequels they'll play around a bit more with the financial side of Armored Core, making those penalties less forgiving, I'm sure. Now, what is probably shocking to the modern gaming landscape is that all cosmetic customization in Armored Core 6 is free. You can choose whatever colors, patterns, emblems, and parts you use for no real-world cost whatsoever. There's even a very in-depth emblem creator where you can basically create whatever images you want. So it is possible to make a good game without microtransactions. Your Armored Core is highly customizable as you can spend hours in the garage just playing around with the paints and patterns, which takes me back to those good old Midnight Club 3 days. If you're a whore for statistics and minute details, then you'll adore the various screens that display all the different effects of the parts and weapons you can slap on to optimize your build for each sortie. If you're just wanting to get out there and have fun on the battlefield, then that's viable too, as you really only have to make sure that you aren't too heavy and that your weapons and parts don't surpass your energy limits. And it's easier than it sounds because the game will just tell you if you're crossing one of those lines. In terms of story, well, just by watching the trailers, I'm sure you can deduce that it's very minimalistic. The point of the Armored Core games is to put you in the shoes of an independent mercenary taking part in a conflict between mega corporations fighting over land and resources. You aren't important. You're just supposed to have fun killing other robots and violating the Geneva Conventions. The story does get a bit deeper, giving you glimpses and nuanced insights into the corporations and the factions they interact with, as well as some characters. The scale we're dealing with here is massive. You are indeed a giant mech, but the world and events around you are much larger. Be prepared to feel small and insignificant. Characters and motivations are shrouded in mystery, and no one quite seems to be themselves, which makes total sense for the current situation. Everyone is dialed in and actually taking the conflict and events seriously, a factor most modern storytelling is sorely missing. There's some similarities between the storytelling of the Souls games and AC6, like the obtuse narratives and unclear lore, but if you're wanting deep and extravagant lore or narrative, the likes of Dark Souls or Elden Ring, then you'll be greatly disappointed. Honestly, it feels like I'm playing one of those aerial combat games like Ace Combat or Rebel Raiders. I'm knee deep in chapter 3 of the campaign and I've yet to see a single human body or face, and at this point I don't think I ever will, which is a super interesting artistic choice as there's humans all over the place living in cities and I guess operating the armored cores and other vehicles, but you never even see your boss, Handler Walter. There's just the chatter between allies and enemies during missions, and outside of that there's essentially just audio logs where Handler Walter will give you some sort of advice or insight about what's going on, or the representatives of factions will be filling you in on things. There's always a briefing before each sortie where formless voices drone on about details and specifications of the locales and enemy forces. It's dry, if anything, but in a very interesting way. It may not be everyone's cup of tea, but I think it's a really intriguing way of telling a story like this, which can really only be done in a video game. You're focused completely on the missions and the gameplay, everything else is just a blur for the most part, and you're left wondering what your purpose in all of this is. I love the concept of being a brain-fried mercenary hooked up to a hulking metal monster, my sole purpose to carry out whatever objectives I'm given with no questions asked. The world building and atmosphere is very bleak and detached, stimulating to the imagination, but not really providing any emotions to attach to. There's little narratives you take part throughout the chapters of the story which delve deeper into the conflicts at hand. Most missions in this game are small and short, having you destroy some enemies or secure an objective, but the longer, more climactic missions are what it's all about. You'll fight alongside allies, take down enemy ACs, which are kind of like this game's version of the NPC mini-bosses throughout the Souls games, but can be fleshed out into entire main boss fights. Bigger story beats will take place, and overall it just makes the game world feel a lot more alive. Of course, there's Soulsborne elements that have made their way into the game, like checkpoints, healing items, chests, glorious boss battles, and more refined combat, but this is by no means a Souls game in space. Yet, there are these same frustrations of getting stuck on a boss that feels way too unfair. The Balteus boss battle at the end of chapter 1 had me so down bad that I had to give in and look up a guide on how to beat him. I hate saying difficult games are unfair, especially from soft games, because they're made to be this way, but this was a pretty hard boss, and I think they may have gone a bit overboard with those flame attacks, as dodging the literal thousands of other projectiles is already hard enough. While it may be considered cheesing, switching up your build to be the most optimized for a certain task is an integral part of this game, and at least in my experience, it doesn't shatter the balance of the mechanics like it could in Elden Ring. But for now, that's about all I have to say about this game so far, except that the art style and soundtrack are both as stellar and memorable as any other From Software game. Seriously, these are some of the coolest looking mechs I've ever seen. It's great to see that FromSoft can branch out and still be great at making other kinds of games while still retaining that X factor that they're so famous for. I wouldn't expect this one to go down in history as one of the greats, however, as most people just won't get as attached to the minimalistic storytelling and atypical game direction, and it's certainly not on the same level as something like Elden Ring or the Dark Souls trilogy, not to mention the mecha genre as a whole just isn't very mainstream, at least not in the way that the fantasy genre is. Nevertheless, Armored Core 6 has been a joy to play so far, and I can't wait to see what else the game has in store.